You're listening to the Converging Paths podcast, brought to you by Asia House and the Barakat Trust, with the support of the Al-Jaffari Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture.
Hello everyone, this is Seif al-Rashidi, Director of the Barakat Trust, and your host for this episode of the Converging Paths podcast. Today we're very happy to have Matt Saba, who's Visual Resources Librarian for Islamic Architecture at the Aga Khan Documentation Center at MIT. He's responsible for researching, digitizing, and cataloging the collections. Before joining the AKDC, Matt studied Near Eastern languages and civilizations and art history at the University of Chicago. He wrote a dissertation examining the palaces of the Abbasids in Iraq, and this will be the topic of today's conversation.
Hi, Matt, and thank you very much for being on our podcast series. It's a great pleasure to have you.
Hi, Seif. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for asking me.
So, you study the Abbasid period, and I wondered, before going into detail, if you could tell us who the Abbasids were, when they reigned, and what was so distinctive about the way they built cities?
Sure. So the Abbasids were the second hereditary dynasty of Islam. So they came to power after the Umayyads, the first hereditary dynasty. And they reigned from around 750 to 1258, so quite a long time. But really, the period in which they were the most powerful was from around 750 up till the beginning of the 10th century. And after that time, they remained in power as figureheads and as important symbolic figures, but their political power had somewhat increased. And in fact, there were competing claims to the title of Caliph from Spain and from Egypt in the 10th century. So that's about the parameters of the Abbasids' reign. And they reigned from Iraq, so they moved the center of gravity in the Islamic world from Syria to Iraq. And you mentioned that their distinctive practice of city building, and I think one of the things that was distinctive about them was the scale of their foundation. So the Abbasids did not tend to build themselves into extant urban situations. They didn't build on top of older cities. And they're not the first to do this. This isn't the first example of founding a city de novo, but the Abbasids founded cities and palace complexes on scales that very much go beyond what came before in the Umayyad period. So that's one of the very distinctive qualities. And in fact, in terms of their palaces, we often refer to them as palace cities because of the connection between the two and also the size of the foundations.
Thanks. And another thing that is of interest to me is, to what extent did they look to the past as a reference? Where did history fit into this dynasty's view of what it did?
That's a good question. So the Abbasids were very interested in the intellectual heritage of the late antique powers and the late antique traditions that preceded them. So one of the most well-known initiatives that the court sponsored was this translation movement, whereby texts in Greek and Aramaic and Pahlavi and other languages were translated into Arabic and expanded and archived. So they were very much interested in both, I think, the Byzantine and the Sasanian traditions, although the Sasanian was more pronounced because they were in Sasanian territory, in what had been Sasanian territory, and incorporated families whose ancestors had been a part of the Sasanian court into their own court. So they were very interested in the Sasanians in terms of their practices, their ceremonial, and in their intellectual tradition. Architecturally speaking, it's a little bit difficult because we don't have as much evidence as we would like of the palaces of the Sasanians, for example, or the Byzantines for that matter, although more and more is coming out all the time. It does seem that the Abbasids adopted certain principles. I mean, scale is one of them that I mentioned. The Sasanian palaces were quite large, and also incorporating things like polo and hunting into both the design of their palaces and their court practices. That also is looking back to the Sasanians as predecessors.
Thanks. It's hard to think of Iraq without immediately thinking of Baghdad, a city that's still very, very important today. Can you tell us just a little bit about Abbasid Baghdad?
Sure. So Abbasid Baghdad was founded by the second Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur. And the original foundation was called Medinat al-Salam, the city of peace. And we have a great deal of information about its design. It was supposedly round, and it had several gates with colonnaded streets that led into a central square where there was a mosque and a palace. Now, there was settlement in the area of Baghdad already before the Abbasid period, but there wasn't a large major city. Ctesiphon, the winter capital of the Sasanians, was nearby, but it was in a different place. So this is an example of a de novo foundation. And the interesting thing about early Abbasid Baghdad is that we don't have it in terms of archaeological remains. The city continued to expand, and in fact, during Mansur's reign, he moved the palace out of this round city that he constructed to a site by the Tigris, and then the palace continued, the center of gravity continued to shift in the city, and it expanded, and the modern city completely overlays this early Abbasid foundations. It's an interesting case where we have a lot of description, actually quite rich description of the city, but nothing from an archaeological standpoint of Baghdad itself, early Abbasid Baghdad.
Well, what are the most prominent aspects of it, the many descriptions that we have of the city? What made it remarkable?
The descriptions focus on the plan. So the circular or this round plan with a double wall and these gates that were aligned on a central axis. So in some of the descriptions, it says that it was as if it was cast from a mold. So this idea that it's geometrically almost perfect, this circular city. So the plan is one of the things that is emphasized. And then other things that are emphasized in descriptions are also the location of the markets, which were originally inside but then moved outside. There are descriptions of canals that crisscrossed, not the round city, but the areas surrounding it, various bridges over the river, and various locations of palaces. So these large palaces that were built by the successors of Mansur along different points along the east and the west banks of the river. But yes, the early descriptions focus on the plan of this round city.
And do you think this geometric plan was it meant to be some kind of embodiment of perfection? What's the idea of having a very symmetrical city, supposedly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to tell exactly what the point of it was from the Abbasid, from the perspective of when they designed it. And certainly, it seems to have been the foundation of the city, the very quick building of it, the drawing of resources from around the empire to build it. That does seem very much like a power statement, like a statement of renewed power, of transferring the capital to Iraq, of establishing a new foundation that has this perfect plan. Whether there was anything else to it is hard to say, because it's not the first instance of a circular or a plan based on some sort of circle. I mean, there's evidence of this from pre-Islamic cities, so it may have been just an adaptation of an older idea. But certainly the new foundation, the rapidness with which it was built, and the drawing of resources from all over the empire speak to an imperial power state.
Thanks, Matt. Actually, your work is more about another Abbasid city in Iraq, Samara. Why another city if Baghdad was this magnificent?
Yes, so Samara was built by the Caliph Mu'tasim, the 8th Abbasid Caliph. And the reason why it was built is not entirely clear, but the sources suggest that it has to do with large military presence that existed at the time. So Mu'tasim and the later Abbasid caliphs relied increasingly on a large military. The sources tell us that there were sort of skirmishes between the population of Baghdad and the military, and that Mu'tasim left and founded a new city to house the military. And there does seem to be some truth in that, because Samara does have these very large military neighborhoods where the army was housed. It was also not the first time that an Abbasid caliph had left Baghdad. So Rashid also left for Raqqa on the Euphrates, where he built a palace complex outside of the existing city. So yes, could have been partially because of the need to house a large military and the problems with doing that in Baghdad, but also the idea of building a new palace. This was something that the Abbasids seemed to have done when they could. So part of it may have also been the opportunity to have a renewed statement of imperial power, especially because it came in the wake of a succession dispute between Amin and Ma'mun that ended with the death of Amin, and kind of a destabilization of the court's situation in Baghdad.
And where did it get its name from?
Right. So previous other scholars have talked about this, and so I'm just sort of rehashing what they've said. But there seems to have been already a toponym related to the name Samara that existed before the Abbasids built there. So it's probably based on an extant name of a town or some small town or village that was already there. But interestingly, in the Abbasid period, there seems to have been this folk etymology that it comes from the phrase surra man ra'a, which means something like he is delighted who sees it. And indeed, they did call it that. So they didn't only call it Samara, they also called it surra man ra'a. So there's an interesting play on words.
And is there anything that made it earn this reputation that you'd be delighted to look at it, given that it succeeds in other cities that's also supposed to be really impressive?
Yeah, I think that this, again, going back to the scale of the whole thing, well, when Mu'tasim built it, we don't have the original mosque. We have the mosque built by Mutawakkil, but broad avenues that were laid out, palaces, certainly Mu'tasim's palace was huge, absolutely massive on this escarpment overlooking the Tigris. We hear of gardens, of waterworks, the army being there in full regalia, and just the feat of building this place, again, very quickly out of almost nothing to become a city that stretched for kilometers along the bank of the river.
And you're specifically interested in palaces. Why do you think the palaces of Abbasid Iraq are so telling and so revealing of the culture?
Yes. So for me, palaces offer an opportunity to really see the interests, the tastes, the preoccupations of the patrons or the architects. Now, I'm not saying that this isn't possible with other monumental architectural forms like mosques, for example. Of course, we can see the interests of the patrons and the architect in mosques. But unlike mosques, palaces are not as restrained by traditions that govern religious rituals. There are requirements and there are traditions, but not to the same extent as other types of buildings that serve a ritual purpose like a mosque. So they offer an opportunity to look at the patrons through the works that they commissioned, and also can evolve in ways that may be unexpected. And I think what I've argued is that these Abbasid palaces reveal a preoccupation actually with the impermanence of architecture, of palace architecture specifically among the Abbasid Caliphs. So it's telling us something about their own preoccupations.
Impermanent seems to be the opposite of what you'd expect architecture to be. So can you explain why they were preoccupied with impermanent things?
Yes. So palaces in particular are an architectural form that are particularly susceptible to change. So because they don't serve a continuing public function as a mosque or a madrasa or another type of building would, and they're very much associated with the personalities that built them and resided there, they tend to be changed, be abandoned, be rebuilt, be spoliated more quickly than other architectural forms. And I think that the Abbasids realized this because it isn't unique to the Abbasid period. Also, Iraq itself, the environment is not necessarily conducive to the long-term permanence of very large buildings because the materials like stone and like wood are hard to come by. Those are more permanent forms. There are, of course, fired bricks, which are very, very much permanent, but they're expensive to make and always available. So the environment, politics of the period in which the Abbasids were relying on this military and had to move around a little bit, even in Baghdad, the location of the palace changed, may have produced this preoccupation with impermanence. And also looking back in time as they were doing, the achievements of past civilizations must have also made them aware of the fact that empires rise and fall. And coming as they did, the obliteration of the Umayyad dynasty
So on one hand, you're saying that they built huge, grand, amazing things. On the other hand, you're saying that they built them knowing that they wouldn't last. What was the mindset behind what they were doing?
Yeah, I think that they're related. The idea to build very large is one way to, even if you can't, so with a very large palace, you can't use these expensive materials throughout. You have to make a sacrifice. And we do see at Samara that fired bricks, for example, were not used to build entire palaces. They were only used for part of the palace. And then less durable materials were used for the rest. So you sacrifice permanence, but building so large is one way to actually ensure that a footprint survives, even if it's as a ruin, even if it isn't serving the function of a palace anymore. And actually, the spectacle of building a very large building, the amount of resources it requires, the performance of building so big, even if the result isn't going to last long, in itself is a way to make a permanent mark. And that seems to have been part of the point of these palaces, is to create a spectacle and a performance of building, even if one caliph might build one palace and then build another one very quickly after that, or his successor move out of the palace or even use materials from his predecessor's palace to build another one.
You mentioned at the beginning translation and literature and writing, and I wondered, your idea is very interesting. Are there any references or sources that tell us about this notion of building spectacular things that are meant to be impermanent?
Well, there are definitely references to spectacular buildings as evidence of the impermanence of earthly power. This is a theme that is evident in a number of different sources that are contemporary to the period. Of course, the idea of the impermanence of earthly power goes all the way back to the Quran and to early, pre-Islamic Arabic poetry. In the Quran, there are references to vanquished civilizations and the use of monuments as a pointer to the contrast between the glory of these civilizations and their eventual vanquishment. So the Iram, the pillared city of Iram, as a reference to the Adites who were vanquished, or Pharaoh, the figure of Pharaoh who was associated with monuments and with a civilization that was conquered. And then in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, there is a very rich vocabulary about ephemerality. Now, these poems aren't talking about monuments in this case. They are describing tents and encampments and very impermanent built environments. But again, part of the point of these very rich descriptions of ruins, campsites, is to point to the effect of time and the changes that time brings and the ephemerality of life itself. So there's a rich tradition of this in the Arabic tradition. And then during the Abbasid period, there are some interesting reflections on ruins, on the monumental ruins of civilizations like the Sasanian civilization. Ctesiphon, there's some evidence that the Abbasids were engaging with Ctesiphon. So Tabari and other historians record an anecdote that describes how Mansur wanted to destroy one of the palaces in Ctesiphon to harvest building materials for Baghdad. And actually, he was advised not to. He was advised not to by his vizier, who said, you should leave this thing as a testament, as a ruin, to show people how powerful the Sasanians were. But now the Abbasids are in power, and that makes the Abbasid Caliph look even more powerful because he has now replaced the civilization that built this monument. And again, with Ctesiphon, the Abbasid court poet Bukhari wrote a spectacular poem describing the ruin. And really the point of the poem is to point to the ephemerality of the earthly power of the Sasanians and how cyclical power is, and how the ruin embodies the contrast between the glory of the people who built it and the current state of dilapidation. So there's definitely a connection made between architecture and ephemerality, particularly monumental architecture, that is evident in some of these texts.
And coming to Samara, what you're saying, I suppose, is that Samara was built knowing full well that it would succumb to the same fate as earlier cities, that it would be this magnificent ruin?
I think that the caliphs must have at least been aware by looking at their own history of moving the palace around and of what happened with the Umayyad monuments, that these things don't last forever, even if they present them as they would. For example, in texts that describe the foundation of Baghdad and Samara, there's an emphasis on how they will be permanent. But I think that the building practices speak otherwise.
Were court poets employed to write about these palaces in a way to ensure the permanence of their memory?
That is one of the things that I argue in the book. There are a number of poems dedicated to describing the palaces in Samara. And this isn't the first time that we have poems describing palaces, of course, but there are 24 of them dedicated to the Samara palaces, which is a pretty big number. And they're very lengthy and rich in terms of their content. It is interesting that poetry was perceived at the time as having a documentary function. So it wasn't just meant to please the audience because of the beautiful language or the clever turns of phrase, but it was also viewed as conveying some element of truth, either about the topic that it was engaging with or about the past. And of course, poetry was a highly valued art form. It was memorized by people who were connoisseurs of poetry and disseminated orally. And increasingly in the Abbasid period, it was written down and disseminated through books. So the fact that there's this huge amount of building at Samara, the buildings don't seem to have been built to last in terms of being a functional palace, and their footprints seem to have been built to last, but not the functionality of them as palaces. Coupled with this blossoming of poetry about palaces and using poems as a way to document what happened, brought me to the conclusion that there might be a connection between the idea that poems could actually preserve the memory of these structures long after they weren't being used anymore, and to actually perpetuate them in myth and in legend.
And are there any texts about writing and poetry being the memory of a civilization?
There is an interesting text that it's a passage from Al-Jahiz, from his Kitab al-Hayawan, where he is discussing the merits of books. And he recorded a conversation or a debate that he overheard in which the various or the relative merits of poetry, prose, and of architecture are being debated as a way to preserve the memory of the exploits or the achievements of a society. And it's really between prose and poetry as which one is better. But it's interesting that the apologists in this debate point to architecture and say, well, this is another way that people try to preserve their memory, but architecture is often the first target of the succeeding dynasty or the succeeding power, and they will often raise the buildings of their predecessors in an attempt to erase their memory. Whereas books and poems and things that contain useful information and that are disseminated through writing and oral means are much more likely to survive. And the apologists point to the works of the Greek philosophers as one example. So yes, there does seem to have been thinking about, actually very explicitly thinking about this problem of how one effectively preserves a memory and the function of the power of words to do this.
And do they reach a conclusion as to whether poetry or prose are better? They say that they're better than architecture, but is one of them better than the other?
If I'm remembering correctly, I think prose wins. Of course, this is a type of debate where both sides are presenting arguments. There may not be an absolute winner, but one of the merits of prose is, the meaning can be translated more easily.
So actually, quite interesting. What you're implying is that they had this long tradition of translating works into Arabic, and also a consciousness that for them to last, the ability for their own records to be translated into other languages would keep their civilization alive, right?
That's one viewpoint, yes. Certainly the translation movement that was actually happening must have brought this idea to the fore. But at the same time, poetry, I mean, one can't deny, especially in Arabic culture, I mean, the importance of poetry and the important place that it held as the diwan, or the record of the Arabs. And even though there were these translations, poetry was still very much an important medium, and it does appear in history books and in other types of works as a kind of reference. I mean, as we would cite another scholar, they also cited other scholars, but they also cited poems as examples to make their arguments. So I don't think, even if in this debate the merits of prose are being defended, I don't think we can discount the merits of poetry also as a way to preserve memory.
And do you think that the Abbasids were unusual in their view that buildings would crumble and words would remain? Or do they actually capture the same sentiment as other Islamic dynasties before and after?
That's a good question. I don't think that they were necessarily unique. There's an interesting comparison to be made with a later example of a palace, Medinat Zahra in Spain, which was built, it seems, on the model of a large Abbasid palace complex. It was also abandoned relatively quickly. And then there were poems written about it, in this case, after the fact. So I don't think the Abbasids were the only ones to have this idea, but the Abbasid period, I think, made this preoccupation with impermanence in some ways more acute because of the looking back at the works of other civilizations, the environment of Iraq itself, and the political situation, which involved this large military and the necessity of moving around. So perhaps they were more acutely aware of it, even if it wasn't unique to them.
I can't claim to know much about Samara, the city that you studied, but one thing that sticks very clearly in my mind is the minaret of its mosque, which is very unusual and spirals round and is very tall. And in listening to you talk, I was wondering whether a minaret that looks so unusual is designed also to be remembered in that kind of way.
That's a great question. I think that the minaret, I'm not sure that the design of it is entirely, it's not designed just to be functional, just as a place for someone to perform the call to prayer. The scale of Samara is so big, and if the mosque itself is so big that would defeat the purpose. But yes, it seems to me to be more of a statement of something that is unique and massive and monumental, and that would be remembered. And it's interesting that the minaret has really become a kind of symbol for the city. It's one of the most reproduced images when it comes to Samara.
Well, also it's easy to describe. It's very visually distinctive. And in being visually distinctive, it's also describable, which, if writing is important, being able to describe something is valuable as well.
That's right. Yes. In the case of the minaret, I think you're absolutely right. It's interesting that the palaces, what's easy to describe about them is the scale and the luxury of the ornament, for example. But yes, the palaces are actually quite complicated in terms of their plan compared to the minaret. So that's an interesting point you make.
Well, you spoke a lot about poetry, and I wondered if there are any poems describing Samara that stick in your mind as being particularly evocative, or lines about permanence or impermanence or anything else that you find particularly beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have a couple of examples if I could quote them.
Please do. We'd love to hear them.
So I'm going to quote a few lines first from a poem by Buhtari, the same poet who described the Arch of Khusro at Ctesiphon that we were talking about earlier. And this is a description of a palace called Al-Jaffari, which was built by Mutawakkil. And I'm quoting here from a translation of Julie Scott Maisami. And this is from the middle of the poem when he's describing the scale of the building. Quote, "You have raised an edifice whose lofty height seems like the high peaks of Radwa or towering Sanbar. It belittles the aspiration of other kings and diminishes the buildings of Kisra in his age and of Caesar. High above the eye's view, as if they gazed at the white brilliance of Jupiter. Its builder is the builder of great deeds. Its lord is the lord of Al-Akhashib, of Safa and Mash'ar. end quote. It's interesting because these are toponyms, the Arabic words, and they refer to various elements of the landscape in Arabia. So he's comparing the palace to these natural large landforms. Let me quote now from another poet called Ali ibn al-Jam, also a court poet at Samara. And I'm going to quote several lines from the beginning of a poem and then from the end of the same poem. And this is about a palace also built by Mutawakkil. And we don't know exactly which palace it is, but the poem is interesting because of its meditation on why people build monuments. So I'll quote a little bit from the beginning and a little bit from the end. Quote, I hear that kings build according to their acumen, and I know that the intellects of men are judged through their traces. The Byzantines have what the ancients built, and the Persians have the heritage of their nobility. When we see the building of the Imam, we see the Caliphate and its abode. We already attributed pride to the Caliphate, and you confirmed the pride of its all-powerful ruler. You built advocating for the Muslims to the unbelievers, innovations that the Persians have not seen or the Byzantines, end quote. And then he goes on to describe the dome and mosaics and the large courtyards of this palace. And then he starts describing the gardens and the waterworks, and that's where I'm going to pick up again. Okay, I'm quoting again now. A platform at a towering height, atop which the fruiting palm is planted. When the wind ruffles the palm leaves, it hears the song of a singing girl plucking strings, a jet of water that feuds with the sky. It does not fall short in its revenge. It returns to the storm clouds what they dropped to earth in their mighty torrents. If Solomon's demons had brought to him some tales of it, he would have known that great skill favors the Banu Hashim, that is the Abbasids. The earth remains built and inhabited throughout your life, O most excellent of builders, end quote.
Wow, so very evocative. And also, what's interesting is that also here they link it to nature.
Yes, in both cases, they link it to nature as an almost like a competition between the architecture and the natural world. And they link it back to previous civilizations as well, and the Sasanians and the Byzantines are always the ones that are mentioned.
And do we know anything about the personality of Mutawakkil, who built these buildings and presumably commissioned people to write about them?
We do. And interestingly enough, one of the things that many of the later historians say about him is that he was an avid builder and that he wasted a lot of money on palaces. So it's not clear exactly if that's true. It's not clear if he depleted the treasury by building these palaces. But it seems that the poems that he commissioned were part of the reputation that he earned later, because the poems are often quoted as evidence for what he did. So he was known as a lover of architecture, as someone who had these huge events, built big buildings, and of course, we also know that he came to a sad end because he was assassinated long after he moved the capital from Samara to Mutawakkiliya, which is a city he founded just north of Samara.
So I guess there's a warning in that what you write down can also count against you in the long run if you're not careful.
You can't always control how people interpret things. That's right.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. What you've been telling us is going to be publicly available in more detail in your upcoming book, right?
That's right.
Can you just tell us the title of the book and when it should be out?
Yes, the title is Impermanent Monuments, Lasting Legacies, the Darul Khilafah of Samara and Palace Building in early Abbasid Iraq. And it should be coming out in 2022, I hope, by the spring.
Well, thank you very much. We look forward to reading it. And it's been a fascinating reflection and challenging, I think, of our perceptions of why people build magnificent buildings.
Well, thank you so much again, Seif, for asking me and for talking to me. It's been a real pleasure.